Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share, and welcome back to my study. After a several-week hiatus, it is very, very good to be back with you here in my study. As you can see, based on the very prominently displayed prop to my right, I am preparing this share. I'm saying this share on Purim. You're probably not listening to it until Shushan Purim. However, I am recording this share on Purim. So, I took a trip to Eretz Yisrael. The trip was supposed to be a 2-week and 2-day trip to Eretz Yisrael. However, because of the snow here on the east coast of the United States, our trip ended up becoming a 3-week trip to Eretz Yisrael, complete with a day trip to Italy, where we boarded a flight in Eretz Yisrael. We flew 3.5 hours to Italy, and in midair over Italy, we were turned around and sent back to Ben Gurion Airport because no airport on the East Coast would take us. The only airport that would have taken us was Chicago, and El Al did not want to fly to Chicago, so we ended up coming back to Eretz Yisrael. As I was leaving the airport to board the flight, I was looking outside at Eretz Yisrael, and I was wondering to myself, when am I going to be able to come back? When am I going to be zeicha to be back in Eretz Yisrael? And Baruch Hashem, I was zeicha to be back in Eretz Yisrael 6.5 hours later. And here we have my anacle. Say hello, everybody. Shalom Aleichem. This is my anacle, Shimon, named after my mechutin, Reb Shimon Mendel, Zechet Tzadik Levracha, who was a Maggid Shir in Yeshiva Staten Island for many years. And it's wonderful to have a little melech over here on Purim. So, hello everybody, welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. So Baruch Hashem, it was a tremendous chus to be in Eretz Yisrael. It's a chus that I appreciate, I think, perhaps more than a lot of other people, because a lot of people nowadays are in the habit of going back and forth to Eretz Yisrael all the time. I had not been in Eretz Yisrael for 43 years. So it was the first time in 43 years that I went to Eretz Yisrael. It was an incredible experience. I have 3 children, Baruch Hashem, living in Eretz Yisrael. I got to see Eniklach that I had never seen. So it really was an incredible trip on many levels. Being that it is Purim, and with everything that's going on now in Eretz Yisrael, by the way, I was on the last flight out from Eretz Yisrael before the craziness began. So since it is Purim, and you have everything that's going on in the news, before we begin with Mishnah Berurah, there's just a couple of things that I'd like to say. Number one, Kiyadua, Hashem's name does not appear in the Megillah. The reason why Hashem's name does not appear in the Megillah is because the avodah of Purim is something which is incredibly pertinent to what's going on right now. And that is, the avodah of Purim is to see the Yad Hashem in the Nistar. Klal Yisrael was under probably the greatest threat to its existence in the history of Klal Yisrael. We had been decreed to be wiped out in entirety. And Baruch Hashem, the Rebbeinu Shalom saved us, but not only did the Rebbeinu Shalom save us, the salvation was so huge that even though the decree was that we should be wiped out completely, not a single Yid was harmed. So we went mikotze el hakotze, from one extreme to the next. We were supposed to be wiped out, and the Rebbeinu Shalom caused such a salvation that not one Yid was harmed. But it was all done without nisim gluyim. There were no, there was no kriyas yamsuf. There was no dam sradeya kinam arav. Everything was palace intrigue. Everything was going on behind closed doors. Klal Yisrael largely had no clue what was going on. They didn't know that Esther is causing a whole new level of palace intrigue with Haman and parties and this and that. Nobody knew what was going on. So everything was very much benistar. And the avodah of Purim was to look at the nistar and see the Yad Hashem in the nistar. Rabbi say, what we have going on now, it's Purim, and we're in Milchama with Paras. It's incredible when you think about it. It's Purim, and we're having a Milchama with Paras. And we killed somebody whose name was Kahamanani. It's mind-boggling. But there's a tremendous risk, and that is that everybody reads the news, everybody's glued to the current events, everybody's glued to see what's going on. And they see that the Israelis managed to knock out, 40 or 50 of the top Iranian officials in the first few minutes of this war. Wow, the incredible intelligence that they have. They look at the United States in all of its might and everything else, and they say, wow, look at this, look what they're doing for us, and look at the sophistication, and wow, we have them outmatched. There's a tremendous risk, Rabbi say, of falling into koichi v'otzim yadi and failing to see the Yad Hashem. Every missile that lands on an empty field in Eretz Yisrael, every time that you hear that there's a missile barrage, and then you read that nobody was harmed, people are tempted to say, wow, they don't know what they're doing. They're such a band of klutses. Their weaponry is so inefficient, or the Iron Dome is so incredible, or David's sling, or the arrow, whatever these things are called. There's a tremendous temptation to ascribe the Yeshua to the United States, to technology, to the IDF, to the Mossad. Rabbi say it's Yad Hashem. And if you fail, chas v'chalila, if you fail to acknowledge that it's Yad Hashem, you fall into what the Chayvus Halavava says. If you put your betachin in anything other than the Rabbeinu Shalom, then the Rabbeinu Shalom will make that thing that you're putting your betachin in will fail. Rabbi say, every missile that comes from Iran has a guidance system. You know what the guidance system is? The Rabbeinu Shalom. The Rabbeinu Shalom takes it, the Rabbeinu Shalom sends it precisely where the Rabbeinu Shalom decided that it should be. Unfortunately, the Rabbeinu Shalom reminds us sometimes how dangerous these things are. Every now and then, the Rabbeinu Shalom is geyser. The missile landed in Beit Shemesh, a tremendous tragedy, wiped out a family. An entire mishpach of Klal Yisrael was killed by a missile that fell in Beit Shemesh. The Rabbeinu Shalom was geyser that that's what should be. But it also serves as a reminder. These things are deadly. But the Rabbeinu Shalom guides every single one, and every one that falls on an empty field is because the Rabbeinu Shalom saved us. Asher pasach al botei aviseinu b'Mitzrayim. The Rabbeinu Shalom went and guided it so that it missed. Every strike in Iran that hits its intended target is because the Rabbeinu Shalom took it to its intended target. Every bit of intelligence that the Mossad or this or that or the CIA, whatever it is because the Rabbeinu Shalom was geyser it that way. Everything that the United States does is because the Rabbeinu Shalom was geyser that it should be that way. Now, of course, you have to have tremendous hakaras hatov. You have to have hakaras hatov to the United States. You have to have hakaras hatov to President Trump. I fly an American flag in July, on July 4th. I flew an American flag out of hakaras hatov to the United States of America. We have to have hakaras hatov, but don't put your betachin in the U.S. Air Force, in the U.S. Army, in President Trump. Don't put your betachin in the IDF. That brings me to another point. I want you to know, Rabbi Say, that when I was in Eretz Yisrael, I'm wearing an up hat, and I'm wearing a long rekel, and I have a beard. When I was in Eretz Yisrael, every time I met a group of chayalot, I stopped, I went over to them, and I said, Toda rabba rabba, amasha atem osim. Makes me unpopular in certain circles. I don't care. They're Yidden. They're Yisraelim. Everyone is. They're Yidden. They're the boys, the girls. They're Yidden. They're Yidnaz. Every single one of them. I love every single one of them. And they're going out and they're putting their lives on the line and they're taking bullets, chas v'chalila, for Klal Yisrael. They're doing it for Yidden. They're doing it to protect Yidden. I'm not interested in getting into hashkafic arguments of what they think. I don't care. It's all this. The bottom line is that they're Yiddish neshamas. Whether I don't care if they're from, I don't care if they're fry. I mean, I care. I would rather they wouldn't be fry. But I don't care who they are. They're going out and they are going into harm's way to protect other Yidden in Klal Yisrael. And you had to see the looks on their faces. When I told them Toda Rabba, their faces lit up. B'simcha, b'ahava. Their faces lit up from the yashikayach that I gave them. And it is incumbent upon every single one of us to be mispal for their welfare. And again, I'm not interested in the political arguments. I'm not interested in the hashkafic arguments. As far as I'm concerned, most of them are bunk. They're Yiddish and neshamas, every single one of them. And I'm mispal for every single one of them. Baruch Hashem, the spirit in Eretz Yisrael is incredible. Everybody I spoke to, they're like, Iran, let them come. And then they say, Bezrat Hashem Yetov. They're not wearing a yarmulke, not a woman wearing jeans. Bezrat Hashem, Baruch Hashem, Akol Yetov. So this is something that we have to bear in mind. It's something that we have to think about, especially on Purim. Again, when that's the Avodas Hayom. The Avodas Hayom, Rabbi Isai, is also Avas Yisrael. My Rebbe, Zayin Gesund und Stark, Rebbe Feinstein Shlita, he always likes to point out that apparently the Yidden on Purim weren't on such a high madrega, right? The Rebbe was Geizer Chas V'Chalil on Klal Yisrael, so apparently they weren't on a very high madrega. Yet, what's the mitzvah that Mordechai, the Chachmasai, was Geizer on Klal Yisrael for Purim? Shalach Manas. I'm going to eat from his house? What's his level of kashrus? Does he use batats? Does he use Reuben, Landau, maybe Rabbanut Mahadran? I'm going to eat from his house? Yeah. Mordechai said that on Purim, we're going to give shalach manas. People are going to take food from their kitchen and they're going to send it to your kitchen. This went against what Haman said. Yesh noi am echad mefuzar u'mefayrad bein ha'amim. He found a chink in our armor, Haman. Yesh noi am echad mefuzar u'mefayrad. He said Klal Yisrael has no achdus. They're broken up into camps. Charedim and chilonim and chardal, chardak, ketchup, mustard, I don't know what. Labels like this, labels like that. I don't see any labels. I see Yidden. That's what I see. I see Yidden. I see Yiddish and neshamas. So another piece of the Avodas Hayom is Avas Yisrael. We have to have tremendous Avas Yisrael for each and every Yid. That is one of the Avodas that we have today on Purim. And with that, against that whole backdrop, I got off my soapbox. Again, maybe it's, back in my study, back in my chair, so I feel more comfortable. With that, we can turn to Mishnah Berurah. So our learning today should be a schos refuah shalema for Meiri Rabbi Reb Shalom Ruvain ben Shema, for Achi Agadol Moshe Meir ben Esther Fradel, Yeshua Levi ben Ahuva Malkachana, Yitzchak ben Tzion ben Dusha. They shall all have a refuah shalema b'sar shar chol Yisrael. Okay, so Mirz Hashem will be learning Daf Reish Chav Zayin Amid Beis. We're beginning with the new Siman Shin Samachet Din Mavui Shenifratz, the halacha that applies to a mavui where one of the side walls became breached. You'll notice that I came back to America with a very bad cold. I didn't come back with a very bad cold. I got a bad cold when I came back. Maybe that's because in Eretz Yisrael it was 75 degrees and sunny. And when I stepped onto the air bridge from the plane in Newark, I got hit with a gust of nasty East Coast United States winter air. But whatever it is, I do have a bad cold, so I'm going to try to do as best as I can. Says the Mechaber Sif Aleph. Mavui, you have a mavui, so let's just remind ourselves. Mavui, surrounded on three sides. Two long side walls, one closed back wall, a front open wall. Now the front open wall has to be niskan with either a lechi or a kaira. Even though this is a rishos hayachid daraisa, really you should be allowed to carry inside the mavui. The chacham were afraid you're going to confuse it with the rishos harabim, so they said you have to make a takana. You have to do some level of tikud, repair, on the front open side of the mavui. Either it needs a lechi, a side post on the side, or it needs a kaira. Now where does the kaira go? The kaira, the cross beam, goes over the open side of the mavui. So the kaira is intended to be over the pesach of the mavui, over the opening of the mavui. Now that fact is critical to understanding this sif and what the Mechaber is coming to address. Now you have, says the Mechaber, mavui. You have this mavui shenifratz by pirza, where there's a breach where mitzidoi, on one of the side walls. So one of the side walls of the mavui became breached. It's got an opening. And where is this opening located? Klape roishoi. It's on the side wall, the breach, but it's near the open end of the mavui. And if you take a look at the side of the Mishnah Berurah, if you take a look at the Be'er HaGoyla, ice cotton bays, you'll see that there's a picture. You see the mavui, and you see the pirza, the breach, is in the side wall, but where is it? It's very close to the front of the mavui. It's very close to the open side of the mavui. So mavui shenifratz by pirza mitzidai klape roishai. Says the Mechaber, im nishar oimid beroishai, if after the breach, so you've got the long side wall coming from the back of the mavui, then you have the breach close to the front opening of the mavui, then you have you still have a standing piece of wall between the breach and the open end of the mavui. How big is that piece of standing wall? Says the Mechaber, im nishar oimid beroishai pas rochav harbot tfachim, if that piece of standing wall is 4 tfachim wide or larger, mutter, then this mavui is still okay. It's still considered a mavui that has a proper tikkun with a lechi or a kaira, and you're allowed to be metaltal inside the mavui. Now, what is the potential problem that the Mechaber is dealing with, and why isn't it a problem? So we're going to see it in the Mishnah Berurah, but let me give you a heads up. As I mentioned in the preface to this sif, where is the lechi or the kaira supposed to be? The tikkun of the mavui. The kaira has to be over the pesach, the opening of the mavui. The lechi has to be alongside the pesach, the opening of the mavui. The concern over here is, if there's a breach on the side wall of the mavui, and that breach, especially if it's close to the front of the mavui, then people might use that breach to go out to the Rishus HaRabim. In other words, I'm inside the mavui. I'm walking to the open end of the mavui. I now have options. I could walk straight and I could go out the big main opening of the mavui, or I could make a turn and I could go out the breach in the side wall of the mavui. Now, that creates a problem, because if you have an option to go out the breach on the side, maybe that causes the opening of the mavui to no longer be considered the Pesach of the mavui. And if it's not considered the Pesach of the mavui, then the lechi or the kaira that's over there is not by the Pesach of the mavui. And if it's not by the Pesach of the mavui, it doesn't work. That's the risk. Now, what did the Mechaber say? The Mechaber said it depends how big is the remaining standing piece of wall that's between the breach and the Pesach HaMavui. If it's 4 tfakim or larger, then it's okay. Then you don't have this problem. Why? So the Mishnah Berurah is going to explain a very interesting thing. The Mishnah Berurah says like this: if when you walk into the mavui, or if when you walk out of the mavui, when you come to the Pesach HaMavui, when you come to the front, if you still have wall on both sides, on one side you have a full wall, on the other side there's a breach, but at the opening of the mavui, there's a piece that's 4 tfachim wide. 4 tfachim is a makom chashuv, right? That we know since the beginning of Chelik Daled. The minimum size for a place to be considered a rishus la'atzmai is Daled al Daled. So if when you get to the front of the mavui, there is a piece of wall that's 4 tfachim large, then the Pesach HaMavui is servicing a makom chashuv. The main Pesach HaMavui, the big wide opening that has the lechi or the kaira, is servicing a makom chashuv, because on one side is a complete wall, on the other side there's a piece of wall that's at least 4 tfachim wide. So since the Pesach HaMavui is servicing a makom chashuv, it's still considered a Pesach, and therefore the lechi or the kaira is still effective. Okay, let's take a look at this in the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is Katan Aleph. Where is the mavui breached? Mitzidai, on the side, klape roishai, near the opening. Pirish, what does this mean? Hamavui hayim asukid b'lechi b'kaira. We have a good mavui that has a proper lechi or a proper kaira. But v'nifratz echad me'aksalim, but one of the walls, shebetzad arkoi, that are on one of the long sides of the mavui, became breached, where? Klape roisha, near the front, samach lalechi yolakaira, near to the front where the lechi of the kaira is. Ice cotton base, im nishar arba tvachim, if you have a standing piece of wall after the breach at the front of the mavui, that's at least 4 tvachim wide, says the Mishnah Berurah, shadai nishar shir chashuv b'mavui, which means that the opening of the mavui is servicing a makom that's a shir chashuv. It's servicing an area that's at least 4 tvachim. Lachein loy batal pesach hagadol. Now the main opening is not batal, because it is servicing a makom chashuv in the mavui. Now, the Mishnah Berurah Barvan's an interesting question. The Mishnah Berurah says, hold it. We're saying that the Pesach is servicing a makom chashuv? You know, when it comes to the context of mavui, really, in a sense, makom chashuv is daled amas, not daled tvachim. Why? Because we learned earlier that the minimum size of a mavui is daled amas. So what are we coming over here with daled tvachim? Says the Mishnah Berurah, even though we learned that the minimum size of a mavui is daled amas, not daled tvachim, that's in order to create a mavui. To make a mavui, it's got to be an alleyway that's at least daled amas. But in our case, shekvar hoya mavui, we're talking about a pre-existing mavui. It has a din mavui. It was more than daled amas long. Elishanistar, just the wall broke and you have a breach. Dai barba tfachim shenishim imenu. As long as you have 4 tfachim oimid, a 4 tfachim piece of wall remaining at the opening, so you're servicing a makom chashuv in a pre-existing mavui, that is okay. Okay, now let's go weiter in the Mechaber. Second line down, says the Mechaber, there's a caveat, and that is, v'hu shaloi tehei apirtza yoiser al eser. But we have to remember something. This breach in the side wall of the mavui has to be less than 10 amas. Because if it's more than 10 amas, remember, under 10 amas could still be considered a pesach, a doorway. So if you have a breach that's less than 10 amas, we still could consider that wall a proper mechitza, right? Even though there's a 9 amma breach, that 9 amma breach is a doorway. So the mechitza is still a good mechitza. But if it's more than that, then it's not a pesach. Then you don't have a mechitza anymore. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ice cotton gimel, v'hu eser amos, it has to be less than 10 amos. Da'achir zehu b'chal pesach, because up to a breach of 10 amos, we could consider the opening a doorway. Yes, it be kind of chosher pirza, but if it's more than 10 amos, it's not a pesach anymore. Now it's a pirza, and now the whole mechitza is batal u'mavotal. V'tzarech list time, you would have to either close it up to less than 10 amos, or you can make it tzuras pesach, 2 lechis and a string or a beam across the top. That makes it back into a doorway. Okay, let's go weiter in the Mechaber, near the end of the second line. All right, now, let's say you have this breach in the side wall, and you don't have a standing piece of wall left alongside the opening that's at least 4 tvachim. If you don't have a closed piece of wall that's at least 4 tvachim, then says the Mechaber Aser, then you're not allowed to be metaltal inside this mavui, because it's no longer considered a mavui with 3 mechitzas that you could be mesakin with a lechi or a kaira. Why? Because the Pesach is not a Pesach anymore. You can only be mesakin the mavui with a lechi or a kaira if you're putting it by the Pesach. But now it's not a Pesach anymore. Why isn't it a Pesach? Because the breach on the side was mavatalit. That became the Pesach. Aser, elim kain, haisa pirtza pachas b'shoshet tvachim. Unless that breach is less than 3 tvachim wide. So again, what halacha did the Mechaber just say? Let's say you have a breach in the side wall of the mavui. So I'm in the mavui, and I'm walking out of the mavui. I come to the front of the mavui, and I look to my left, and there's a breach in the side wall of the mavui. And let's say the breach is 10 tvachim wide, the breach, right? So you have, coming from the back of the mavui, I got the side wall coming up. Now I got the breach that's 10 tvachim wide, and then I have a little standing piece of wall left, all the way at the doorway, all the way at the big entrance of the mavui. But it's only 2 tvachim wide. So the doorway is no longer servicing a makom chashuv, right? It's only got a 2 tefach wall on its side. So now you can't be masakin this mavui with a lechi or a kaira, because even though there's a lechi or a kaira at the front, that's no longer considered the Pesach, because now maybe the side pirza is the Pesach. But, says the Mechaber, what if that breach is less than 3 tvachim wide? If that breach is less than 3 tvachim wide, then limud says it's closed. Well, if limud says it's closed, it's not a breach. If it's not a breach, it can't obviate the main Pesach of the Mavoi, and therefore it would be okay. It says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Daled, Aser El Imkain, Da'avagav de Bapachas Be'eser Amas Mikri Pesach. Now you might ask, I don't understand. Why is this whole thing an issue? A breach that's less than 10 amas wide is a Pesach. So why am I worrying about this breach in the side wall that's 10 tefachim wide? It's not 10 amas. Why don't we just consider it a Pesach? What's the problem? Says the Mishnah Berurah, that's exactly the problem. The problem is that it's a Pesach. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Hachachayishinan, Dilma Shafki b'nei Amavoi Pesach Amavoi v'yelchu b'Pesach zu. Problem is that, yeah, it's a Pesach. But you can't have a Pesach because you need the front of the Mavoi to be a Pesach, because you're being masakin it with a lechi or a kaira. So it has to be a Pesach. If that's a Pesach, it obviates that Pesach. And maybe people will use this opening on the side, lekatzer darkam. Maybe it's a shortcut. Maybe somehow access to the Rishus HaRabim is actually easier through the side pirza than through the front opening. So maybe people will stop using the front opening, they'll use the side opening. We'll bought the lechi the lechi or kaira, and that's going to obviate the lechi or the kaira at the front. Shehem tzrichel yois b'Pesach hamavli, because the lechi or the kaira has to be by the Pesach. V'hu ein shem Pesach mavli alav. But that main opening is no longer the Pesach, because now the side opening is the Pesach. Unless the breach is less than 3 tvachim, the chashuv kesasim. Because if the breach is less than 3 tvachim, then limud says it's closed. And if limud says it's closed, then we don't have to deal with this breach at all. Okay, so now let's move along to Sif Beis, 3 lines down near the end of the line. Now, before we go into Sif Beis, we have to put Sif Beis into perspective by just taking a look quickly at the halach of Sif Aleph. So again, in Sif Aleph, we're talking about a mavui shenifratz by pirza mitzidai klape roishai. We have a case where one of the side walls of the mavui was breached. And where was the breach, said the Mechaber? Klape roishai. It was near the front of the mavui, which again, you could see the picture in the Beragoyla Sif Ice Cotton base. What's the halacha? Well, there's a couple of variables we have to look at. If that pirza is larger than 10 amas, then that whole mechitza is batul u'mevutel. Because if the breach is larger than 10 amas, it can't be considered a Pesach. It's a breach. The whole mechitza is breached. You don't have a mechitza on that side of the mavui. If the pirza is less than 10 amas, then we have to look at its position along the side wall. If it's all the way to the front, so that, not all the way to the front, but if it's close to the front, but there still remains a standing closed piece of wall at the front of the mavui that's dalet tefachim or larger, then the mavui is okay. Why? Because when you come into the Pesach HaMavui, it's servicing a makom chashuv, so the Pesach HaMavui is considered a proper Pesach HaMavui, and it could be niskan with a lechi or a kaira. But if the piece that remains closed at the front of the mavui is less than dalet tefachim, then this mavui is no good. Why? Because the main Pesach of the mavui is no longer servicing a makom chashuv, right? It's not surrounded on 2 sides with a mechitza. It's got a tiny mechitza on one side, less than dalet tefachim. It's no longer a Pesach. Now the side opening could be considered a Pesach, right? You have 2 competing psachim over here. Now that side Pesach could be considered the Pesach, and now the mavui is not niskan beroishoi. It doesn't have a takana at its Pesach of a lechi or a mavui, a kaira, and therefore you can't be metaltal in the mavui. Now, against that backdrop, let's take a look at Sif Beis, and we're going to have a problem right away. And the Mishnah Berurah is going to tackle it. Says the Mechaber Sif Beis, Nifratz mitzidai shaloi klape roishoi. Let's say the side wall of the mavui is breached, but it's not breached towards the front. It's breached towards the back. Take a look at the Beragoyla Ice Cotton Daled. He has a picture over here. You see that the side wall is breached. Where's the breach? All the way back, near the back wall of the mavui. Now let's stop a second, and let's do the math. So again, we have a mavui where the side wall is breached. So what do we have to determine? Well, if that breach is bigger than 10 amas, game over, right? Because the side wall is batal mavatal. It's not a mechitza anymore. But if it's less than 10 amas, so then the breach is a Pesach, right? You still have a mechitza. What's the second variable that we have to look at? Well, is there still a standing piece of wall between the breach and the front of the mavli that's larger than dalet tfachim? If there is, we should be okay. Now, if the breach is all the way in the back of the mavli and it's less than 10 amas, then if we do the math, this mavli should be fine. The breach is less than 10 amas, and if the breach is all the way in the back of the mavli, well then certainly from the breach to the front of the mavli, you have standing wall that's more than dalet tfachim. So there should be no issue here. So even though we didn't read much of the Mechaber yet, but when we see the beginning of Sif Beis, Nifratz Bitzidoi Shaloi Klape Roshoi, right? We do the math in our heads, there should be no problem here at all. So let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Vav. Nifratz Bitzidoi. Hainu. What's the case of the Mechaber? Deloi Nifratz Samach L'Roshoi. The breach is not near the front of the Mavli, near the opening of the Mavli. Elabifnim Mimenu. The breach is deep inside the Mavli. Vim Kain, now, if so, says the Mishnah Berurah, Kasha, what's the Mechaber want here? Dahainu Dina de Sif Aleph. If the breach is near the back, we already covered this case with the halach of Sif Aleph. You have, between the breach and the front of the Mavli, you have more than dalet tfachim. So what's the problem? The Mavli should be 100% fine. So why is the Mechaber covering this again? There doesn't seem to be any need to address this case. Dirshu Achrayim answer. You're right, says the Mishnah Berurah. The beginning of Sif Beis is really just an extension of Sif Aleph. The Chol Shenishar Pasar Bo B'Roshai having the Nifrat Shaloi Klape Roshai. If you have standing wall from the front of the Mavli going to the breach more than dalet tfachim, really that is called that it's Nifrat Shaloi Klape Roshai. Once you have standing wall from the front of the Mavli going to the back of the Mavli, you have more than dalet tfachim, then really it's not Nifrat Klape Roshai. It's not breached near the front. No, it's away from the front more than a Mokum Chashiv. It's distance from the front more than dalet tfachim. Really, that's called Nifrat Shaloi Klape Roshai. And really, there's no problem here. There's no issue. Everything is fine. We covered this in Sif Aleph. So why is the Mechaber repeating it? Misham Seifa Nokte. The only reason the Mechaber mentions this case is because of the halakha that's going to come now that we didn't read yet. Now, let's go back into the Mechaber, Sif Beis. So, Nifratz Bitzidoi Shaloi Klape Roshai. You have a Mavli that's fine. It has a breach on the side wall. But the breach is set back deep into the Mavli more than dalet tfachim. And says the Mechaber, Shiuroi Be'eser. So, the first variable you have to look at is the breach bigger than 10 amas or not? If it's bigger than 10 amas, you have a problem. If it's less than 10 amas, you have no problem. Why? Because it's less than 10 amas, so it's a Pesach, and it's deep into the Mavli. So you have standing wall of more than dalet tfachim going to the front. So the main Pesach of the Mavli is servicing a Mokum Chashiv. Everything is fine. Now comes the Chiddush that the Mechaber is going to say. In such a case, where the Mavli is fine because of the size of the breach and the location of the breach, you should know it's kosher, says the Mechaber. Even if the breach in the wall goes all the way down to the ground level. So a car hit the wall of the Mavli and it breached the wall of the Mavli, right? Says the Mechaber, if based on the size and the location of the breach, the Mavli is still okay, it's okay even if the car took out the wall all the way down to the ground level. What's the Chiddush of that? The Chiddush of that, the Mishnah Berurah is going to say, is very simple. You might think if the wall was breached all the way down to the ground, then it's seriously a competing Pesach to the main Pesach of the Mavli. If it's mamish breached all the way down to the ground level, it's very easy for the Bnei Rishos Harabim and the Bnei Mavli to travel through this new breach. So maybe now it's really a competing Pesach to the main Pesach, and maybe it's Mavatal the main Pesach, and maybe now you can't be Masakin in the main Pesach with a Lechi or a Kaira. Kamash Malon, no. Even if it's breached all the way down to the ground, If based on the size of the breach and the location of the breach, the mavli is okay, because we consider the main Pesach of the mavli still a good main Pesach, so then it's good, even if it's breached all the way down to the ground. With one caveat, says the Mechaber. Who? Delay Baki Barabim. It's Purim, so I have some wine here. The caveat is, it has to be Delay Baki Barabim. It has to be that Lamaisa, the people are not constantly using it. If the people are constantly using that side exit or entrance from Rosh Hashanah or to Rosh Hashanah for the Mavli, then you have a problem. But if not, it's okay. You can still be Masak in the main Pesach of the Mavli with a Lechi or a Kaira. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. So we already started Ice Cut and Zion. Let's go a few lines into, Ice Cut and Vav. Let's go a few lines into Ice Cut and Vav. Umishom Seifa Nokte. The Chiddush of Sif Beis is in the last caveat, the caveat that we just learned. Not the caveat. The Chiddush is, even if it's breached all the way down to the floor, it's still okay. Says the Mishnah Berurah. It's as if what Sif Beis is telling me is, there's halakha that we said in Sif Aleph. That if you have standing wall remaining at the front of the mavli of Dalit Tvachim, it's mutter ad eser amas. It's mutter unless the breach is bigger than 10 amas and can't be considered a doorway. This halach is true, even if the breach goes all the way down to the ground level. However, there is a caveat. But this halach is only true, so there's a chiddush in Sif Beis that expands upon the heter, which is that this heter, if you have standing wall of Dalit Tvachim at the front of the mavli is okay, is true even if the breach is all the way down to ground level, so it's easy for people to walk in and out through the breach. Still, it's okay, but there is also a caveat. The caveat is, but it's only okay if Lamaisa, people aren't using this breach as a doorway all the time. Says the Mishnah Berurah Cut and Zion. The Mishnah Berurah is going to give us discuss now another case. Before we read it inside, till now, we've been discussing a breach in the side wall of the mavli. So we've been discussing a classic mavli. 3 walls, 2 long side walls, a back wall, and the front is completely open. Now the Mishnah Berurah is going to tweak the case. Let's say, besides the 3 walls of the mavli, there's also a partial wall closing off the front end of the mavli. Now, basically, if you have a partial wall closing off part of the opening of the mavli, you still need to put up a lechi or a kaira. What are you going to do? You're going to put the kaira, let's say, from the side wall of the mavli on one side, and you're going to put it on top of the partial wall, right? You have the side walls of the mavli, then on one side you have a right angle coming in, you have a partial wall closing off the fourth side. So you'll take your kaira, you'll rest it on top of the side wall of the mavli over here, and then you'll come across to the partial wall, and you'll rest it on top of the partial wall over here, and you'll have a kaira closing off the opening of the mavli. Or you'll take a lechi, and you'll put a lechi over here, or you can put the lechi over here on one side of the opening of the mavli. Now let's say what happened is the partial wall became breached. Okay, this is your partial wall closing off part of the front of the mavli. The partial wall became breached over here. So now what you have is, I probably should have drawn something, but I didn't. I wonder if this will help. Okay, here's your mavli. Here's the front side of the mavli. The front side of the mavli, imagine that it's completely open. It's not completely open. Imagine this is the opening of the mavli. And you have a partial wall. So you see my ruler? The mavli is closed off from this corner until the ruler. So on the front of the mavli, you've got a partial wall. So fine. So you'll put a kaira, right? You'll put a kaira from here to here. Or you'll put a lechi over here, or you'll put a lechi over here. And that's how you'll be misakin the mavli. But now, let's say what happened is, you have your partial wall over here, and your partial wall became breached. Where did it become breached? Let me make the partial wall a little bit bigger. This is your partial wall at the front of the mavli. And it became breached. Where did it become breached? It became breached between the corner, between the side wall and the end of the partial wall. It became breached somewhere in the middle. So now you have the side wall, then you have an open section, and then you have a standing section of partial wall over here. What's the din in that case? Let's see it inside. It says the Mishnah Berurah. Let's say the breach is not in one of the side walls. Let's say the breach is in the partial wall that's partly closing off the front end of the mavli. The mavli is closed on three sides. And part of the open fourth side is also closed off. And you were masakin the mavli by putting up a kaira, a cross beam, on top of the opening of the mavli, or you were misakin it by putting up a lechi, a side post, on either side of the opening of the mavli. This kaira, let's say, was running from the top of the partial wall ad hakoisel shekenegdai until the side wall. So again, you have like this. You have a partial wall and you have the side wall. You put up your kaira over here from the end of the partial wall to the side wall. Then what happened? V'nase pirza b'mkai mastima, and now the partial wall was breached. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Shari ad eser amas, kol sha'ayim anisha merubal aparetz. What's the halacha? Well, before we see what the halacha is, again, what's the issue? Tell you what the issue is. The issue is that, again, if this is your front open end of the mavli, and there's a partial wall that's closing off part of it, right? And now the partial wall is breached. Now, okay, I want to adjust this a little bit. It's that mirror image that throws me off all the time. This is your partial wall, okay? This is your partial wall, and this is your opening. The tikkun hamavli is over here. The kaira is going across the top over here, or there's a lechi here or a lechi here, right? So that's the Pesach hamavli. Now, if the partial wall over here gets breached, maybe that breach is a competing Pesach. Maybe now this becomes the Pesach hamavli, and this doesn't have a lechi or a kaira. So that's the potential problem. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the halacha would be shari ad eser amas. First of all, how big is that breach? If that breach is bigger than 10 amas, well, then it's completely breached. If it's completely breached, then it's definitely a competing Pesach. So it's mutter unless the breach is more than 10 amas. Shari ad eser amas, kol sha'im anisha merubal aparetz. But the standing part of wall in that section has to be larger than the breached part. Why? Very simple. Again, this is your open end. This over here is your partial wall. It's become breached. If it's paretz meruba ala oimid, if in this section there's now more open area than closed area, and on this side this is completely opened, then the part that's oimid, let's say the ruler is the part that's oimid. Let's say this is the piece that's standing. If the breached part is bigger than the part that's standing on this side, and the open part is also bigger over here, then the standing part is bottle. It's bottle because on both sides it's paretz meruba ala imid. So then it's bottle. And if it's bottle, then there's nothing standing. If there's nothing standing, then the section that's considered opened is a competing Pesach to the main Pesach, and it's not niskan with a lechi or a kaira, so that would be a problem. But if it's not 10 amas and it's oimen merubal aparetz, says the Mishnah Berurah, this would be okay. But the Yeshayim are those that say the hacha that in such a case where you have a breach on the front end of the mavli in the partial wall, the hacha sheyesh pirza baruch revius beinon sheyamunach hakayra dafka al koslei amavli mikotz ala kotze. There are those that say that in such a case where you have a breach in the partial wall on the front of the mavli, then it doesn't work if the tikkun hamavli is a kaira going from here to here, or a lechi here, or a lechi here. You would need the kaira to go all the way across the top of the mavli, all the way from one end to another end. And the reason for that is because they say if the breach is on the front open end of the mavli, that's a much more serious competing Pesach to the main Pesach. And if you don't have a kaira or a lechi that's being misaken that part of the breach, then you don't have a kosher mavli. Most Achrayim disagree, and they hold that if the main opening is niskan with a lechi or a kaira, even if the breached part to its side is not, it's okay. The gamze shayach la mavli, because the other Achrayim look at it and they say no. If the breached area is oimid meruba ala parutz and it's less than 10 amas, it combines with the main opening of the mavli, and if the main opening of the mavli is niskan with a kaira or a lechi, it's okay. Kilo hayamunach al kaisel mavli. The gamze shayach la mavli. Mashiach pritza b'tayim nispatal gami oimid. You do not need a lechi over on the side that's breached next to the other side wall of the mavli. If you have a lechi in the main opening, it's okay. The words samach labayis are a little bit funny. I don't know why he says samach labayis and not samach lakaisel, but that's what it means. Says the Mishnah Berurah, even if the breach in the side wall of the mavli goes all the way down to ground level, it's still okay. What the Bechama wants to say is, even if the breach is all the way down to the ground level. So it's really very easy for people to use that breach as a doorway back and forth to the Rishus HaRabim. We don't look at that breach as being competition to the main opening of the mavli, so that we should say that now the Pesach HaMavli is not niskan with a lechi or a kaira. Since it's in the sidewall, and since it's less than 10 amas, and since, based on its position, there's more than 4 tfachim standing on the side wall to the front of the mavli, it's okay. But the caveat was, I cutting tests, the loy baki barabim. But it has to be that Lamaisa, the rabbim, is not using it. Pirish, shayabaka betunif, maybe the rabbim is not using it because it's muddy. I'm a kulkul betit. It's true that it's breached all the way to the ground level, but it's not paved. It's muddy. There's puddles over there. It's dirty. So there's a reason why people are not going to start using it, and it's not serious competition to the main Pesach HaMavli. Vein derech rabbim lavar b'yisa b'chitza. The choshkenim nishtarim in a kaisel by yisoid shloisha about tvachim goiva al pnei kol apritza tizeh bevadim akiv hilch b'nei adam. Certainly, if the breach does not go all the way down to ground level, certainly if there's 3 or 4 tvachim of height of remaining wall, so that you have to step over it in order to get in or out, then certainly it's not considered a competing Pesach, and then certainly the Mavli would be okay. We're going to stop over here, and we will continue with the parentheses in the next chair. Again, it's wonderful to be back. It's wonderful to be saying share to everybody again. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The source of limud HaTorah should be making God's Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe should send Yeshua's refuahs, parnasa, and shidduchim. The Rebbe should protect God's Klal Yisrael b'chol makom shehem. Everyone, you're probably listening to this on Shushan Purim, a freilich Shushan Purim, and we should be zeicha. We should see simcha and geula of Yeshua. We should all, the Rebbe should send the kanfei nesharim. This should be the mapala of Paras that the Gemara speaks about, that before Mashiach comes, Paras will have a mapala. This should be it. By the way, it's another thing I wanted to say earlier that I didn't get a chance to. There's a lot of prognosticators out there who like to talk about all the different Mamare Chazal and say, oh, this must be Mashiach. Halavai! But we don't know what these things mean, Rabbi Isai. We look at these Mamare Chazal and we don't know what they mean. So we can't look at them. There's prognosticators that got up and say, oh, this Zichar means. Doesn't Zichar mean nothing? You don't know what it means. All we know is we're B'yad Hashem. The Rosh Hashanah wants Mashiach to come now. Mashiach will come right now. He wants Mashiach to come in 5 minutes. He'll come in 5 minutes. Mashiach will come, and Mashiach will tell us that was pshat in the Gemara, ma'toivim anoim. But for us to look at the Gemara and say, oh, this zicha means that, we don't know what we're talking about. Okay, Kol Tov, be well.